I'm Robert Hazel, and I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy in the Department of Political Science, and I'm the convener of these seminars, and we plan them in collaboration with our academic colleagues in the department, but also with all of you. So the first thing I want to say is to issue an invitation to you, and in particular to the students, to let us have your ideas for future seminars. We already have a full program for Term 1, and you can see the details of that on the website, but we're still looking to fill some slots in Term 2. And last year, we had a couple of suggestions from the students, which led to seminars, including a really good one on China. So please come forward with your ideas, but come forward quite soon, because we will probably complete the program for Term 2 in the next few weeks. And just to give you a plug for the next few seminars in Term 1, next week we have Professor Sir Malcolm Grant, former Provost of UCL, who is now the chair of NHS England, and he's talking about his new role and what it's like to be running the health service in England, supposedly at one remove from government ministers, but he will tell us, I hope, how much ministers are breathing down his back. And then in week 3, we have 2 professors from the department, my colleague Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit, and Professor Tony Wright, a former senior backbencher from the House of Commons, and they are both talking about the English question. And then in week 4, we have Sir Alan Moses, the new chair of the Independent Press Standards Organisation, which is the new regulatory body to try and regulate the very unruly British press. He's talking about his new role, and we hope to have a couple of journalists speaking alongside him. So that's just a taster for the first month of this term. And now, enough from me. Can I hand over to tonight's chair, my colleague, Christine Reh.
Thank you very much, Robert, and a very warm welcome from my side too. So my name is Christine Reh, and I'm directing our department's MSc in European and Public Policy. So welcome to those students in particular. So this time last year in this very room, we were talking about the question whether the May 2014 European Parliament elections will be different, would be different. And in October, this was just the time when Europe's transnational political parties were beginning to put forward lead candidates for the job of the President of the European Commission. Now, the elections in May were preceded by TV debates between those candidates. One of the debates was, or the first of those, was organized by Michael Shackleton on our panel. But the turnout itself was relatively stable, and the Eurosceptic vote really increased. Now, after the elections, Jean-Claude Juncker, and you probably all followed the saga of his appointment, became Commission President. He was the lead candidate of the centre-right European People's Party. He was nominated by the European Council, but against the explicit votes of the UK and Hungary, and he was then voted in by the European Parliament. Now, the so-called Spitzenkandidaten process really was a political first in the history of Europe. It put transnational parties center stage, it politicized the appointment of the Commission President, and it really resulted in a pretty fundamental and partly irreconcilable debate about where Europe's legitimacy, or the EU's legitimacy rather, should come from the heads of state and government, intergovernmental, or from the European Parliament, directly elected. I think it's also fair to say that the process got a lot of media attention, but probably at the stage not before the European Parliament elections, but afterwards, when it came to the political row over the nomination. So 1 year after last year's event, and at a time when Juncker's new team is being questioned by the European Parliament, we would like to discuss the long-term consequences of the Spitzenkandidaten process, the institutional one, but also the political one, the policy one, and especially the consequences for the UK, with our panelists, whom I'm very happy to introduce. Paola Buanadonna, who is the media director of British Influence and who used to be a BBC journalist. Michael Shackleton, Michael Shackleton, Special Professor on European Institutions at Maastricht University, and worked for the European Parliament most of his career. And his last job for the Parliament was heading the UK office here in London. And Simon Usherwood from the University of Surrey, who is one of Britain's leading experts on Euroscepticism. So I think they are very well placed to discuss the question with us tonight, and they're going to speak in reverse order to my introduction. So Simon, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here because I did my undergraduate degree in the building just next door to this one. So a mere 20 years later, I've managed to move one whole building. So that's progress of a sort. I think the first image I want to give you is of the dancing dog that Samuel Johnson talked about. And he said that it's not that it's done well, it's that it's done at all. And I keep coming back to this image when I think about the Spitzenkandidaten process, because really it should have died a death a year ago. And that it's been as successful as it has, I think, is a testament to the persistence of the European Parliament and the political groups involved, and also to the lack of engagement and foresight on the part of national governments. So I want to kind of pull those ideas apart a little bit and then bring them back together. For me, what we've been seeing with the European elections and the Spitzenkandidaten is the next stage in a process that started at the turn of the millennium. So the Laeken process that led to the convention, that led to the constitutional treaty, that led to the no votes in France and the Netherlands, that led to the period of reflection, that led to the Lisbon Treaty, that led finally through Ireland to the introduction of that treaty. Finally, 14 years later, we are coming to see some of the real fruits of that process. And this strengthening of the link between the European Parliament and the Commission, I think, is a manifestation of that process of constitutionalization that was very strongly put forward at Laeken. And there's a bit of a paradox here, I think. On the one hand, we've strengthened the European Parliament's status again. We've said that the majority candidate from the Parliament then becomes the Commission President, and shapes the Commission in his or her own image within limits. Now, that's a strengthening process, but actually I think one of the things I've been struck by this week with the hearings of the commissioners has been the way in which the Parliament has recognised that actually that also strengthens the Commission. And the Parliament, I think, never likes to be told what to do. Even if it's by a sympathetic body such as the Commission. So that we've had assorted commissioners being asked to come back again or to resubmit their questions, their answers to the questions, is an indication of the way that the Parliament still sees that there is more work to be done. So we're in a process that's going on. At the same time, the other thing that really strikes me is how much all of what has happened has been a very contingent political process. And I want to pick on three elements here. The first one is the impact of the Eurozone crisis. That the restructuring of policy, of governance, that's been required since 2008 has had ramifications. So we've seen it in the structuring of the Commission, the strengthening of the economic team that is there, and the focus that's been given to that kind of agenda. So I think that in terms of the programme of work that we're going to see over the next 5 years, that is going to be a key part of what is going on. Second contingency, if you like, it's a long-term contingency, is the impact of enlargement and the diversification of the European Union. None of the leading posts in the Commission, the European Council, in the Parliament, well, not in the Parliament, that undermines it. Forget about the Parliament. Apart from the Parliament, the big member states don't have the big jobs. and I'd even argue that the President of the European Parliament is not the biggest job in the world. Okay, we can discuss that. We'll discuss that. No, so not even necessary, says Michael. So if we think about the people who've got the jobs, we've got, for the first time, an East European, Donald Tusk, having the presidency of the European Council. We've got the large member states getting important sounding portfolios in the Commission, but under a lot of constraint. So none of those portfolios are ones which they can operate with a free hand. So the system of vice presidents, I think, is an indication of the extent of political control that Juncker is going to have, and the limits that are going to be put on people going off message. But for me, true to my research interests, I think a key contingency this year has been the UK and its position towards the EU. Brexit, to use another new word we've all learnt this year, still, I think, remains unlikely. But everyone is being very careful about it. The Parliament and the Commission have tended to be cautious about how they treat British interests in this matter. Juncker, I think, did a very good job in managing his way through his own appointments. And as he said, he didn't want to give the impression that he was annoyed with the British. He didn't say he wasn't annoyed with the British, he just said he didn't want to give the impression, which, as we will all appreciate, is an important semantic difference. But also, in giving Johnson Hill an important portfolio, an important sounding portfolio, he has reduced some of the potential criticism that might have come his way. And even the hearing that Hill had yesterday could have been much more strongly pursued if it had been so desired. So there's a whole lot of acting with kid gloves in this process. And I think really what everyone is waiting for is the outcome of the general election next year, because that is actually the important thing for British membership. It's not about things that are happening now or the European elections. That UKIP did very well is neither here nor there in that respect. So ultimately, to go back to my starting point, what I think we've seen again is the adaptability of the European Union. Once again, it has changed its organisation, it's changed its structures and its processes in the way that it has always done ever since it was first formed. The question for me, and one that I hope we will get to discuss, is whether adaptability is the same as resilience. We can see lots of different futures for the European Union in the next 5 years, and indeed in the next 2 years. And we might want to think about where those different paths might lie. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Despite being a little bit older than Simon, I'll stand up. But I'm still standing up after I've said what I want to say. One of the great privileges of no longer working for the European Parliament is that I can say some things that I didn't really feel I could say when I did work for the European Parliament. So I thought, despite having some sort of academic pretensions, I would try to be a little bit controversial and try and suggest that the Yunker Affair, as I'd like to call it, actually has at least 5 lessons that we should draw from it. That it meant something more than just something that annoyed David Cameron. That it had something deeper in it that I think is worth pondering and considering, because I think that deeper understanding of it will help us to understand what is possible in the future. So, the first thing that I think it showed was a significant lack of imagination in the British political class. It seems to me that the possibility that the European Council might end up nominating the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg was simply dismissed as, quite frankly, a ludicrous idea. And I don't think anyone can gainsay me on it, because I was one of those people who said it was a good idea to have a competition. And indeed, I and Christine and a few others wrote a letter to the Financial Times for the pains, the result of which was that the following day we were told we were completely and utterly misguided, and that, quite frankly, it was an absurd thing to be suggesting that Jean-Claude Juncker, if he were to be the leader of the largest group, should be considered as president of the Commission. I and others pointed out that, well, look, but the treaties do provide for a majority vote inside the European Council. So the fact that Britain didn't necessarily want him wouldn't necessarily stop him being appointed. And I was told, don't be so stupid. We've stopped 2 federalist prime ministers before from becoming president of the European Commission. One of them, Jean-Luc Dehaene, in the time of John Major, and the other, Guy Verhofstadt, in the time of Tony Blair. And the point was made, if we say we don't want him, no way will the others overrule us. And I think that that just shows a kind of inability to understand that the rules of the institutions do matter. I'm not saying it necessarily had to be the case that we would be outvoted, but that the rules themselves made it a possibility that it was not seen, because there was a very great failure of imagination. And I think this lack of imagination applies across very wide sections of British debate on the European Union. I only hope that nobody assumes that Lord Hill will make it because he was nominated. We nominated him, so he should be appointed. Well, yes, the European Parliament has a hearing, but we understand we have to go through that process, but we shouldn't assume that it will make any difference. Well, if next week we were to find that he might be recommended for some other portfolio, don't say that you haven't been warned. It seems to me not inconceivable. It's only inconceivable for those who can't imagine another future. And I think that's one aspect of what happened that was very important. The second thing was that I thought there was a basic British unwillingness to engage with a new political dynamic. 4 European political parties, as Christine pointed out, the Socialists, the Liberals, the Greens and the Left, put forward candidates to compete against Juncker contest his wish to become the next president of the European Commission, because everybody understood that it was rather likely that he would be the leader of the largest party, though the Socialists for a while seemed to have chances to get in front of him. Well, what was the British reaction? Well, the British Conservatives, of course, said, well, our party at European level, the Alliance of European Conservatives, isn't putting forward a candidate, so we're not interested in this. So we are absenting ourselves from this debate automatically. More interestingly, actually, is the response of both the Liberals and Labour, because both of them said that the candidates chosen by the parties that they are affiliated to, Martin Schultz for the Socialists and Guy Verhofstadt for the Liberals, were considered too, in inverted commas, federalist. I'm not sure now if the word federalist is a word we can't use following the Scottish referendum. I noticed that Timothy Garton-Ash now sees the possibility for a federal Britain in a confederal Europe. So perhaps the anxieties of the word federalism are less than they were before. But it was clear that both parties did not wish to be seen to be supporting the person that had been nominated by their own party. And indeed, they went so far as to say, we don't want to see them in our country. So actually, if you were lucky, you might have seen Guy Verhofstadt at an event organised in Manchester by Chris Davis, a Liberal MEP who organised an event for him. But everybody said, don't say that Guy Verhofstadt's in town, please don't mention it. And Martin Schultz apparently visited Northern Ireland, but there was no question of him being seen on the mainland. Again, what I think is interesting about this is that Labour said, well, the fact is, we don't disapprove of the process, we just disapprove of the individual. Okay, let's see what happens in 2019. Let's see whether Labour, I just take them as an example, is willing to engage with a process which I would suggest will be repeated in 2019, whereby it will have the chance to be engaged in a longer process of trying to select a candidate, and will it be willing to accept the logic that it actually could be put in a minority in that selection process and might find a candidate that it didn't particularly like. Well, I don't think the omens are very good from all that I can see of those people in the parties that I speak to. I don't think they'll be keen to do this. The third thing is that the British political class, not just the parties, proved unable to come up with convincing arguments to contest a basically democratic idea. The whole point of putting forward competing candidates for Commission President in advance of the European elections was to challenge the notion that the European Commission President should be selected by heads of state and government behind closed doors. How could a successful candidate be perceived as legitimate if she or he had not been obliged to explain what they intended to do and to defend that vision against the vision of others before the elections took place? The almost universal British response to this was something that I felt strongly because it was directed at me in particular, but a few others, very few actually, was almost universal, that once Juncker had come out as being the person who was leading the main party, the EPP, because it had won the most seats, well, that's all very well. But actually what Europe needs, we need the best candidate. And not someone with new ideas, not an aging politician, 59 years old, oh, if only I were 59, tainted by association with the EU for a couple of decades. Now, apart from the difficulty of finding such a candidate, no names were put forward, and nobody said that they wanted to do this job. Absolutely nobody. The fact is that nobody was willing to say whether actually selecting behind closed doors by the European Council was or was not a more democratic thing to do than the way in which it was done through the Spitzenkandidaten experiment. Now, I'm willing to have an argument about this, and it obviously depends on competing claims about the nature of democracy in the European Union. But I can't see how you can avoid entering into an argument about democratic principles when the Lisbon Treaty has actually now included a specific set of provisions on democratic principles. We have to argue around them as to whether the status quo is adequate or not. I wonder what people would say if the idea of the President of the European Commission being elected in Europe-wide electoral competition were put forward. What would be the response to that? Would that be considered as a way of reinforcing the democratic legitimacy of the institutions, or would it be perceived as a way of undermining the nation-states of Europe? I have a suspicion as to which it would be. Fourthly, and I think quite importantly, there was absolutely no recognition of the growing importance of European political parties. The treaty now states, I'm sorry to quote the treaty, but I think it's worth it, Article 10.4 of the Treaty on European Union says, political parties at European level contribute to forming European political awareness and to expressing the will of citizens of the Union. You can say that's an absolute load of codswallop. It doesn't mean anything. Well, the fact of the matter is, we've signed up for it. It's in the treaties. We have it. And there's little doubt that the appointment of Juncker has strengthened the position of these parties and given them the opportunity to develop their role further. Lots of people, I think, in Britain fervently hope that what happened in 2014 was an aberration, and it will not be repeated in 2019. And the European Council said, well, it was important to review these matters in 2019, when, frankly, almost nobody who sat in the European Council in 2014 will still be in office. So it's not very likely that any of the people around at the moment will have much to do with that discussion. It seems to me much more likely that there will be greater efforts expended by all concerned, not just the parties, but also governments, to prepare the ground and to generate a Europe-wide debate well in advance of the European elections. Will Britain take part in this process, or will no one be willing to take the risk? Finally, I think the Yunker Affair shows that reform in the EU has to go with the grain of the institutions. The success of Juncker was due, at least in part, to the increasing influence of the Parliament and the reluctance of the European Council to engage in a major institutional battle. It constituted a reform of the system that fitted into the way in which the institutions worked. It was something that was possible to conceive of, to imagine, within that structure. Hence, the great debate in the UK over a reformed EU. Apparently, we all want to stay in the EU if it's reformed. None of us quite know what we want it to how we want it to be reformed. It has to start, in my view, from an acceptance of the constraints and opportunities offered by the present structure. It's not enough to say, I would suggest, that I will not take no for an answer, as the Prime Minister did yesterday. Rather, it's a matter of putting questions around which common answers can be devised. Curiously, and British influence have pointed this out in recent days, much of the policy agenda sought by the British government has already been endorsed by the European Council, and Juncker as next President of the Commission. So, kind of, what's the problem? The policy agenda doesn't seem to me to be totally at odds with what could be done at European level. But I'd suggest that the real issue isn't about policies, where there's always room for opt-outs, derogations and reviews. Rather, it's an argument about institutions. Can Britain live at ease with a set of institutions that have an independent growing role of their own, which may conflict with that of the UK government? And is the UK willing to work actively through these institutions in seeking to resolve those conflicts? If it isn't, the next years will be very uncomfortable with or without a referendum. Thank you very much.
Well, these were two very difficult acts to follow. I'll do my best. I don't speak as an academic or a policy expert. I speak as a foreigner, a non-British former journalist who has been involved one way or the other in the European debate in this country for about 20 years. And I'm afraid my take on all this is that the sophistication of the institutional debate in the way that you have so very clearly laid it out, Michael, is a million miles away from where we are at the moment in the state of the debate in this country. And I don't make this as a comment on. I don't wish to comment on this as being a positive thing or a negative thing. I just don't think that we in this room, who take an interest in these issues, are on the same page with the vast majority of the public in this country. Not because we may or may not be more or less pro-European. I don't presume to know and to assume that you are, but because really my feeling is that these institutional questions are incredibly far away from the minds and the consciousness of people in this country, because in part of the way that Europe has been presented and by the leadership under either governments in the past 20 years anyway, and filtered through the media, of which I was a part, so I could tell you how it worked behind the scenes. And I'm afraid this level of sophistication, of in-depth sort of thinking about how the institutions work, how could we make them work better, what place Britain could have in them to exert more or less influence towards greater, better, different goals, we are not there. As far as I can tell, we are fighting an existential fight, if you happen to be pro-European, to prevent this country from sleepwalking out accidentally in a referendum that has been promised for a variety of reasons that absolutely made sense at the time to the people who made them, but which do not, unfortunately, don't take into account the reality of how and this referendum would be fought and in what conditions and after how many years of misinformation and hostility, overt or covert, and so on and so forth. I have a couple of observations to make out of what you guys just said. Something that Simon said, and I wasn't quick enough in my notes, so I don't remember what it is that you said that triggered this thought in my mind, but here it is. There's a lot of talk about renegotiation, and what I despair about is the fact that the political leadership in this country is either unwilling or unable to explain to the public that the process, that the act of membership, the reality of membership, is a constant process of renegotiation. And that, on the other hand, the moment you waltz out, you lose any influence and any power to determine which way the European Union, which remains very much on your doorstep, which remains very much your main trading partner, develops. So there is this false dichotomy being set up, and it's been going on for years. Now the word renegotiation really is the mot du jour, as it were. But I was around at the time of the beef wars, of the sort of non-cooperation, John Major in a straw, refusing to take party meetings, etc. It's always been thus, as far as I can tell. But now this word renegotiation, it really does crystallize this sense that it's there is a state of affairs, and then there's Britain trying to get something different or something better for itself. I mean, Europe has continuously changed, as Michael has said. It has adapted. In fact, you were saying this, Simon. It was adapted continuously, and that's how it survives. And that's why, despite the fact that it's a bewildering, confusing, complex, and maddening entity, if you've seen the beast from the inside. Despite all of that, it's the best thing to the alternative, which is Europe not existing, the Union not being there, this set of rules not being created, these countries not trading together, following rules that they've decided, etc., etc., etc. Which brings me to another consideration, is you were talking about the lack of imagination, you were talking about the unwillingness to sort of deal with these issues, etc. I would characterize this mindset in the political leadership in this country as a state of magical thinking. If you've got a 3 or 4 year old at home, you'll know that the state of their development is such that they think that if they close their eyes, the world can't see them. And I think that sometimes that's the state of that's how the debate about Britain's position in Europe is carried out by pros and antis alike. In other words, we are debating this as if Europe would stop existing the moment that Britain pulled out of it. And this is the great unanswered question from the sides of those who want to pull us out of the EU, is can you present, what is your alternative? How can you be sure that Britain would be better off, or would indeed be able to negotiate this and that or the next, and that it would trade so much better with the rest of the world, etc., etc., etc. All those fantastical assertions that are made without a counterfactual, when in fact, we know that Europe, the only fact we do very much know is that Europe would continue to exist, minus the UK, without the UK interest being represented, without perhaps a certain pragmatic, way of doing things and of focusing on problems that Britain definitely takes into the mix. So I don't have any deep thoughts to contribute to the Spitzenkandidaten process in particular. I would second what Michael has said. This is a process that caught the elites by surprise. And to my mind, they've spent the last couple of months in a state of complete denial with their hands over their faces, refusing to actually see that, paradoxically, maddeningly perhaps, it is going Britain's way in a certain way. We have an extraordinary alignment of potential ally in other leaders in Europe at the moment. The European elections were a disaster for a lot of countries, apart from mine, bizarrely. The Italian leader did fantastically well, but that didn't really last. But he experienced a rare frisson of popularity at that point. So Europe is not laughing in a corner going, well, it's all fantastic, we don't need to change anything, it's all brilliant, if only Britain stopped moaning. Absolutely, Europe is in crisis. Everywhere else there is a sense that the institutions have to shape up, that legislation has to be simplified, that the whole mechanism has to be geared away from fruitless discussions and more towards growth and job creation and so on and so forth. And we have allies in this. Britain is not alone in saying this. Michael was mentioning this agenda that was agreed. So a few days after Juncker's appointment, when the headlines here were dominated by the fact that Britain was alone against everybody else and Juncker had been appointed and it was the end of everything, etc., at the June Council, all 28 leaders signed this document in the Council conclusions, the strategic agenda for change, for the Union in times of change, detailing very much all the areas of reform that Cameron had outlined in the Bloomberg speech 18 months ago, I think it was. And therefore there is now a rare opportunity, a moment where politically, leave the institutions aside for a second. I'm not particularly interested, for instance, in the institutions. That's not what makes my heart beat faster. But there is an actual, opportunity to get stuff done. And it seems to me that the danger is that Britain is locking itself into this language of battle and war and isolation, etc., which does not bode well if indeed this country is going to go to a referendum in a couple of years' time. We don't know that yet, of course. It's all depending on May. We've done some polling, and I conclude with this, at the beginning of the year with YouGov, asked people a certain number of questions about Europe, about their feelings, etc. And one thing that came out that was very staggering was this, that people on the one hand overwhelmingly felt that Britain had no influence. Britain had no influence at all. That Europe was something, Brussels was something that was being done to us. 60% of people said that. And on the other hand, there was a great wish for leadership in Europe. They would, there was I can't remember the exact wording of that question that gave us that answer, but the answer was, yes, we would like to know that we could get stuff done at European level, but that's not what we hear. That's going to happen. So immediately after the Scottish referendum, the weekend immediately after that, we haven't spoken about the Scottish referendum, but I'm sure there'll be questions about that because there are interesting links. We ran another poll that weekend. We asked people whether they felt that the country was more or less divided than the year before, and of course, unsurprisingly, 55% of respondents said it was more divided, 76% in Scotland. Then we asked them whether they would agreed or disagreed with the question, with the statement that in order to unite the country, we must now move beyond the divisive arguments about Europe. And 53% agreed or strongly agreed, and only 18% disagreed. And then, even more surprisingly, in my opinion, we asked whether they agreed that a new vision for a truly united kingdom should include leading in Europe in the coming years. 45% agreed, 22% disagreed. The space in between is our chance, basically. Turning those percentages in between, those undecided in between, into people who would want Britain to lead in Europe, Because guess what? Europe doesn't disappear the moment you pull out of it, but it still sits there, and you still have to pay to sell your goods in it or apply the laws that are decided, etc. That is the scale of our challenge, I think, in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Simon, Michael, and Paola. Would you like to react to each other briefly, or not? Oh, up to you.
People always say, I'm not interested in the institutions. And as somebody who's sort of got a bit of a reputation for writing about the institutions, I'd like to just defend this, that nothing gets done without institutions. You say, we want to do stuff. Do stuff. How? You know, you have to have a mechanism, and the mechanism's not neutral. The institutional rules influence the kind of policies that you can or cannot get. So I'd only put in a small rider. Policies and institutions are intimately interconnected, and that's why Britain cannot escape from a debate about the institutions by just saying what we want is a digital agenda and a fully developed single market. There has to be some conception of the means by which it will be done. But that was just an aside.
I would just exploit my role as the chair to briefly react to Michael on this. So I also think this element of surprise, which you were all talking about, so it caught the British elite by surprise. I think if they had watched the EU institutions in action over the last decades, or even the last years, I think shouldn't have. Because if we look at what Simon was arguing, this is the end of a constitutionalization process. It was also the end of a process of the European Parliament reading the treaties very expansively. I think no one who had watched the European Parliament act in the last decade should have been surprised that if there's a possibility in the treaty that they push for the Spitzenkandidaten process, they would. And the other thing, I think there's also a direct spillover, in my view, from everyday decision-making, everyday legislation, because I think that saw a lot more cooperation, not just between the Parliament and the Council, but between the parties in the Parliament and the parties in the Council. And I think part of what the Spitzenkandidaten process was an example of parties across Europe really working together. And I think that became visible in the legislative process. Another thing that has become visible in the legislative process is the increase in majority voting in the Council of Ministers. The numbers have gone up a lot. So I think majority decision-making has become much more accepted, much more possible. So I was a little less surprised maybe that the European Council actually did outvote the UK and Hungary. Just an aside. And one small comment on what Paola was saying. So if you are saying it's very difficult to take the debate to a sophisticated level, then I think David Cameron's statement this week is about supporting a no vote unless he got the reform, which he would find satisfactory, is of course a hugely difficult political statement, because that requires an exceptionally high degree of sophistication to sell to the British public that a certain reform he will maybe negotiate in Brussels is actually big enough to sway the public vote. Sorry, I've bypassed them. Sorry, no, your turn.
It's just to pick up on a couple of points. I think on the question of European political parties, I think I'm still a bit more cautious than Michael on this, if only because the European parties are made up of national parties who, in the case of large groups, are often involved in governments. And so they have other interests in the EU, particularly through the Council and the European Council. And so I think that's one of the reasons why member states got a bit blindsided by the whole process, because they were acting as parties in one area, in one direction, but also acting as governments in another area. And I think that creates a certain tension. So I think European political parties are very much a work in progress, and I think there are going to be some limits to growth in their influence. The other one, again, is about the relationship between institutions, which are important, but also about ideas. And this actually picks up on a point that Paola mentions, which is that the UK is actually very successful in its ideas. So let me tell you about a great European figure in British politics, Margaret Thatcher. The young people amongst you might not have heard of her. She was Prime Minister. And she was a really supportive person for European integration. So she supported the Single European Act. She supported developments in a number of areas, reform of the budget in a rather contrived way. But actually, one of the things that she's well known for is being anti-European. And the place where she expressed this was at another place I studied, the College of Europe in Bruges, back in the late 1980s. And there she made a speech which was seen as going against the conventionality of integration, and she was roundly lambasted for this. But if you look at what that speech actually says, it talks about an EU which is interested in completing the single market, in pursuing deregulation, in having a European defence led by NATO, in a whole range of things which are conventional now, which have been internalised into the system. Now, that's not been done by conscious British policy solely. It's been by the process of ideas being diffused, of building coalitions, of moving in a crabwise direction. So, actually, the EU looks very British from that perspective. And we need to recognise that the framing of debate is really important in all of this, which is why we've all, I think, talked about it in different kind of ways.
I agree with you, Simon. This is the great irony that far from not having any influence in the system, in the EU, in Brussels, in Europe, whatever name you want to give to the blob, this negative entity that stalks us, etc. The EU as it exists now, it seems to me, has been, well, I wouldn't say it's a British creation, but it's been hugely shaped by Britain's interests and Britain's priorities and Britain's ideas in the past 40 years, ever since Britain joined. That's why, as an Italian who has lived here for most of my life, actually, I feel at a personal level, aside from the job I do every day, I feel puzzled and in a way saddened by the fact that we've now reached a point where, you know, the majority of people you poll think that Britain is the Cinderella in all this, that Britain has no influence, has no say, because they're only going to find out, essentially to their cost, if they pull out, if Britain pulls out, that what it is like not to have any influence and any say. And that's not a step you can go back on. And I'm not saying this in a sort of scaremongering way. I'm saying this in a sort of, you know, this is a statement of fact. If we don't manage to turn the debate around and present people again with evidence that Britain has led in Europe and can lead in Europe, is leading in Europe in some ways now, you know, we might have a situation where people sleepwalk out, and that's not desirable, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. I think we should open the floor now to questions from the audience. I hear from Dimitrios that we will try to do this without a microphone. If I could, so I'll collect 3 questions at a time. There's one at the back, a bearded gentleman at the very back. Who else would like to come in earlier? Gentleman in a blue shirt and someone in a red t-shirt in the middle. So.
Would you like to say who I am, where I'm from?
Yes, please, and you probably also need to shout.
I'm really indeed. Nick Dimitrios, formerly City Group, but NDK solicitors. 2 points. Europe doesn't fear Britain, Europe fears the United States, i.e. Britain, America. That's what Europe really fears. If Britain eventually pulled out, the agreement the United States and Britain will take with them whoever they deal with. Second point is, European Union is going to probably break up the euro currency, in my opinion, by 2020 anyway, not the union, but the currency. So if the currency falls apart, where is the future for the union?
Great. So one question that was about the United States, one about the Eurozone. Gentleman at the front, please.
Michael, you seem very pleased with yourself. I'd like to suggest you're actually playing with fire. Sorry, my name's Michael Roberts, but we know each other. You point to the democratic imperative that the Spitzenkandidaten system has introduced. Yet, is it so democratic when the winner is someone who didn't even stand for election in the parliamentary elections, who was chosen in a smoke-filled room in Dublin, when his rival, Martin Schultz, was the only candidate put up on the centre-left, when the other main candidate, Verhofstadt, yes, he did indeed face a serious challenge. But it wasn't such a choice, was it? There were no primaries. Citizens didn't get a chance to have a real choice. You talk about the need for Brits to engage on the institutional politics. Do you really mean that? Do you think that Brits are interested in struggles between the European Commission and the European Parliament and the member states in the Council? I mean, we do know that in 35 short years, the Parliament has accreted to itself massive powers, and by and large, this has been good. Over co-decision, over budget, the hearings that are going on are generally a good thing. But what actually happened in May, June this year was a coup. Because the treaty says, and no one's mentioned the treaty, the precise article of the treaty, Article 17, it says, taking into account the elections to the European Parliament, the European Council, acting by qualified majority, shall propose to the Parliament a candidate for President of the Commission. The European Council shall propose. What actually happened was that the European Parliament said, there's one candidate we'll accept. And don't bother putting up anyone else because we won't accept him or her. The European Council has lost any control over the nomination process, the process that's set out in the treaty. It's been upset, and I think the consequence for this country, and not just for Britain, but for countries that are worrying about Euroscepticism, not least France, the northern Scandinavian countries, it's a major problem. Do we really want this?
Thank you very much. And so that was a long question. And a question in
the... My name is Ranjiv, just an observer here. My question is not going to be that long. My observation is that we had Manuel Barroso coming over here during the referendum in Scotland and siding with the No campaign, which I found quite strange, to say the least, because he's supposed to be impartial on these sorts of matters. And I just want to know what the panel's viewpoint is, why he took a view of that nature. And another point would be that a lot of these quasi-situations in the European Union is not really understood by the general public. And that's one of the major reasons for this lack of interest in the process of doing things. And after what's been happening with Scotland, the Basque territory and other parts of Europe would like to have the opportunity to have their own referendum. And in Spain, I realized that the central government is not very keen on that, but the local government in the Basque area is very, very keen on having that. And there's huge demonstrations about this. So as time goes on, my observation is that Europe would have to release some of that authority and power. Otherwise, they can't evolve, as been alluded earlier on, because this evolution is not really taking place. They seem to be stuck at the moment.
Thank you very much. So a question on the United States and the Eurozone, was it a coup? And a question related to Scotland and devolution or devolving powers sort of downwards. Maybe I can add a question to Michael's question to Michael. If the European Council had wanted things to say exactly the same as they were in the Nice Treaty, right? The European Council nominating, the European Parliament approving. Why did the European Council agree to changing the wording of Article 17 in the Lisbon Treaty? So that would be, I think, a question to ask to the European Council. If you wanted it to stay the same, why did you, heads of state and government, hand this opportunity to the European Parliament on a golden plate? But sorry, that was, again, I'm using my role as chair. Who would like to start?
In no particular order. Yes, it was a coup in those terms, but so was the empty chair crisis back in the 1960s, which produced an outcome which wasn't in the text of the treaties, where we reached an understanding which was beyond the wording of the treaty text, and which allowed for a national veto in the cases of vital national interests, which were never specified in any great detail. Again, it's this process of an evolving system. So I agree, it causes a lot of problems, and it creates a lot of unhappiness at a time when the EU probably could be doing with trying to create a more positive set of attitudes around it. So I think, yes, but it's understandable. And I think that relates then to the other point that's just been made, which is that this treaty provision has been around for a long time. It's been there since the convention, and I've heard a former president of the European Parliament talk very proudly a couple of months ago about how he had pushed this agenda at the time with this specific plan in mind. Now, it's been looked at by not just the European Council, it's been looked at by endless numbers of politicians, of civil servants, of foreign offices. It's been around the block many, many times. Now, I agree, if you didn't want to create that possibility, which I think was not so outlandish, then you shouldn't have changed the text in the first place. So that suggests at least a degree of acceptance by member states that this could be pursued. And I think actually probably what it was let's see how it works in practice, with the understanding that it might well not work. If the Eurozone does collapse, which I don't think it will, because if it hasn't collapsed after everything it's been through in the last 6 years, I'm not entirely sure what it would take to make it collapse. Maybe the pound joining would tip it over the edge. If the reason it hasn't collapsed is because if it did, it would fundamentally compromise the whole of the European Union. And that's why so much effort was put into making sure that Greece didn't leave. And I'm happy to say that I never thought that Greece would leave the Eurozone for exactly that reason. Once you create the possibility of exit, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We go back to the ERM back in the late 1990s. So again, there are dynamics at work where the costs are very considerable to certain members of the Eurozone.
The dynamics can go on forever, though.
Yeah, the dynamics do go on forever. That's the joy of politics, is that there is no stable equilibrium in the long run, that things will always change. And again, this actually ties in with the question about secession and the impact on membership. I think Barroso was trying to be helpful, and as I think he realised, it wasn't really helpful, which goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, that one of the reasons why we haven't had European Union officials weighing into Brexit type discussions is that they know that probably it will just make matters worse. So it's better to sit on their hands for the time being and work it out.
What do you mean helpful? Helpful to the government, I suppose.
Yeah, helpful to the government, helpful to different interests that are out there. We can talk about whether Scotland could join if it were independent, maybe later over a drink or two. So yeah, I think that, there are dynamics there. But again, the whole system is constantly in flux, and actually that's the theme that joins together all three of your questions, is that the compromise changes, and it's always a compromise. And that's why it's so unsatisfactory, because nobody gets exactly what they want. And I think that's maybe the key problem, that we haven't communicated to people very clearly, is that you don't always get what you want. It's a song, isn't it? And you can't always get what you want. And if we understand that that's the nature of democratic systems, that then we might get a bit further along in this process.
And yes, I think I agree with the way you've summed this up. I mean, I think sometimes we get the impression that democracy means what we want, winning the argument. But that is not true at national level, really, and that is clearly not true at supranational level, and international level, and at the level of the European Union. Exerting influence doesn't mean getting your way on every single point. It means negotiating so that you give in some some aspects that are not terribly important to you in order to get something else. You do a favour to that country that time, because then they'll remember to support you another time when the thing on the table really, really is essential to you. I mean, that's statecraft, that's diplomacy. You don't expect the person in the street to have a vision of it, an understanding of it, but you expect the elites to be able to articulate this if they want to bring people with them. And I think what's dangerous about the situation now is that the elites, both in government and in opposition, seem quite paralyzed with fear about this question of Europe, and so they've made it toxic, and now it seems to be too toxic to sort of deal with. That seems to me to be the paradox. If I understood Nick's question, I think you were hinting at the fact that there will be consequences for Europe if Britain left, and not just the other way around. Absolutely. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear.
Markets, I was going to say, dollar to euro, foreign currency markets.
Yeah.
Volatility.
True. I think overall, but basically yes, there will be consequences either way. I think that it would not be great for Britain, but I also do fear for what the rest of Europe would like without the influence of Britain in it. And I mean, again, there is no counterfactual. I can't tell you what would happen exactly, whatever. But I can tell you that as an Italian, I come from a political culture where, people were, before the Eurozone crisis, Italy's taking a real battering and the mood is not great, I can tell you. But in my country, the sort of popular wisdom was that it was much better to be part of this club where, sort of cooler heads and sometimes wiser voices were in charge, because Italians have never had a particularly high opinion of their own leaders. In that sense, we are ahead of you by about 20 years, but you're catching up with us. And therefore, there was safety in numbers. If we're part of this wider entity that has to take these decisions that are not just for the narrow interest or whatever sect is in charge at the moment, things can only get better, kind of thing. Michael, I am no constitutional expert. I can't tell you whether it's a coup or not. I have an observation to make to this, Michael, which is this. What I didn't understand about this system is it didn't seem to me to make sense to have these names done and dusted ahead of the election, because that absolutely de facto ruled out sitting prime ministers who might have been tempted to put themselves forward, who might have made stronger, better known, bigger candidate. They might have been. I don't know. I mean, and by definition, if you had to put your hat in the ring ahead of the European election, there is no way that a sitting prime minister would be able to do that. So that's my question mark of the whole process. It seems to absolutely prevent anybody of real stature to take part. Rajiv, well, the Europe of regions, my gosh, you could have a whole seminar about that, Clearly there is a European, clearly in countries where there are very strong, very defined regional identities or national identities within states, Europe is seen as a place where you could be a small country, but you could be part of this bigger thing. And therefore, I think that's, in the case of Scotland, I mean, I can hazard a guess as to why Barroso might have wanted to make an intervention, because, of course, Spain feels that it could be next. Whether it is the place of the European Commission President to make such, that's a different that's a different story. But I think this point is fascinating to me. We're talking about, we're living in this globalized world where we're competing with everybody all the time, and the case was made when Scotland was decided, look, you've got to be very careful because you're going to be this small country What if your natural resources run out, etc., etc., etc. And those in Scotland who wanted to secede, many of them were saying, but we'll be part of Europe. You know, globalization is taken care of. We are part of this wider market. And of course, then the argument became, but you won't be able to join, or it will take 20 years, or other people will stop you from joining. But nobody actually said, I don't remember anybody saying, oh, but no, but it's terrible, surely you don't want to be part of the EU, which is what the rest of Britain is told all the time. So that strikes me also as quite ironic. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, I don't have so much to say about Scotland or the Euro or TTIP. These are issues, I do have views on them, but I don't think I have any particular standing on them. I think I need to come back to what Michael had to say, because it was slightly personal. And it's interesting that Michael, you thought that I was sort of slightly smug and self-satisfied, like, you know, I was a winner and these silly British government lost out. If I gave that impression, I didn't mean to give that impression. And I would like to say one or two things. First of all, I've seen a few coups in my time. In 1967 in Greece. Now, I walked around Greece under the colonels. I also know what an attempted coup is like when somebody goes into the Cortes in Spain in 1981 and fires a gun. I think you need to be very careful about using the word coup. For me, a coup is associated with something military. To actually suggest that the European Parliament is mounting a coup, one needs to be very careful with language. It is true that the circumstances were that the Parliament found itself, dictating the terms, but it seems to me that this was partly a result of certain contingent circumstances which might not be produced under other conditions. One of them being, what would have happened if Mr. Schultz had come first? Is it actually the case that the Christian Democratic, more EPP-oriented governments would have been willing to nominate him? I don't think it's by any means certain that they would have been willing to do that. I think the second thing I'd say is that, look, this is a process that's in evolution. It isn't stuck in one place. There was competition in the EPP between Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier, who, quite frankly, in my own humble opinion, was a much better candidate. I thought that Jean-Claude Juncker, let's be absolutely clear, I heard him in the Maastricht debate, he was absolutely appalling as a performer. I would never have voted for him on the basis of that. But he was voted for in the Dublin Congress of the EPP on the 6th of March of this year, and he got 352 votes to 265. There was an open competition between those two people. And who were the people who voted for them? Well, actually, yes, you're quite right, Simon. There were governments, their parties, and notably the German CDU, who voted for Juncker, and for whom it was extraordinarily difficult then to change their minds afterwards. It would have been much easier, if there hadn't have been a competition in the EPP, for Mrs. Merkel to say, I don't see why we should necessarily back Mr. Juncker. I know he was voted without any opposition, just as Mr. Schultz was, by the way, without any opposition. It seems to me that they made a rod for their own backs to a degree because they had supported him in that competition. Were there no primaries? Yes, actually, there were primaries. The European Greens, don't know if anybody knows that, but you know, the Greens put forward 4 candidates, of which they chose 2. And the primary that took place between December and February December of last year into February was an opportunity for anybody to take part and to say that which of the candidates they prefer. There's every possibility for this system to be developed further, and I think it will be, because people will not stand still. They will want to make the system more attractive. Would a sitting Prime Minister be willing to put himself forward? Well, quite frankly, the idea that you go into elections thinking you're necessarily going to win would mean that actually nobody would stand for anything if they had to be guaranteed to win. If you really care about it enough, you're going to try, and you're going to try and see if you can win. I accept Jean-Claude Juncker was not a candidate, and I think that's something that is to be regretted, and I think the system will change and it'll be more difficult. in future. So I think nobody is claiming that this system was perfect, that it was wonderful, that everything worked well. No, the question is whether you really do want to go back to the system that we had before. And the fact, and I'm pleased that both Simon and Christine pointed out to me, that that system was, in a sense, disavowed by the governments themselves in the changes that they made in the Lisbon Treaty, which was a compromise arising from the discussions in the Convention. We can discuss all the history of it. But it was partly an acknowledgement that the system as it existed before was not adequate. And if you think it's not adequate and you think this system's not adequate, what's the alternative? And I think that's the challenge, not to say everything is rosy in the garden, and I'm really sorry if I gave that impression. I didn't want to.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so second round of questions. I have two ladies at the right, yes, who just look at each other, and a third question, a gentleman in the third row from the bottom. So, the lady in pink first, yeah?
Maria, I'm a scientist from Imperial. I was just wondering whether, well, it's just a point really, for all this debate as to how Britain will be better off in or out, not just Britain, but any other nation, and what the role in Europe is. And I think there's two major issues that need to be solved or addressed, definitely in Britain, not so much in other countries. And it's the matter of education. Does Europe as an institution get taught within the syllabus? And I mean, do people know what Europe is? It seems to me that in this country, the whole debate as it's presented, the debates only happen at this university level, very specialized departments level. Whereas the general public, all they hear when they hear anything about Europe is either a political party slugging them off, you know, as in, you didn't get what we wanted, or well done, pat on my back, I said no to Europe. They never address what the question was, and why would that be better for Britain? Because really, there is no equal debate on the media as to, there is no pro-voice ever. So I think Europe has been slowly misunderstood. It has become this black hole that people don't really care about because basically they don't understand it, not that I do. And then it's been used and demonized slowly, and its image is being eroded. And it's very easy to blame Europe when one doesn't want to look into their own affairs. So whenever something goes wrong, it's just used as a political tool, basically. And until we say no to that, and we begin giving it its due attention, I don't think it would be constitutional even to have a yes or no vote, because we will be misled.
And, thank you very much. A question about education as a prerequisite for holding referenda, really. Great. And you please, in the black room.
So I'm Sophie, I'm doing a Master's in Academic here at UCL. My question is related to democratic legitimacy, which has come up a bit in all of the panelists' talks, but I want to ask something about democratic legitimacy regarding to the European people, which is something that hasn't been mentioned yet. It seems that most of the European Parliament election, but also especially the construction of the Commission in these hearings, has been about national governments and national interests. And really, the interest of the European people as a whole hasn't really come into, well, especially the British media and the public discussion. For instance, Jonathan Hill, the Prime Minister Cameron, he said that he wasn't sure if British interest was served until he was awarded that big name portfolio. So I'm wondering, is it at all possible in the next 5 years that democratic legitimacy for the European people will come back into the question? And do you see this happening any sooner, or is it just a looming issue?
A question about EU legitimacy and a European people versus a national interest, or many national interests.
Thank you. I'm Richard Robinson, formerly a Birkbeck Master's student, and I was a candidate in the recent elections. Simple question.
Congratulations.
Do you think the Spitzenkandidat process has changed the balance of power among the European institutions?
That was a short question.
That's what we asked for.
Exactly. Thank you. So, Michael, you look like you want to start.
Do I?
No? Yes?
Oh, well,
sorry.
all right. Okay, very quickly. Nothing in the European Union radically alters the balances. Everything is a gradual process. And I think it's fair to say that the Spitzenkandidaten process, partly for contingent reasons, did actually help the European Parliament. Whether it has structurally improved its out of all recognition, I don't think so. I think it's much, much more important that the European Parliament has full co-decisional rights on legislation. Much more important. But I still think, so I don't see it as a major coup in that sense. I think it's a gradual development. On the democratic legitimacy point, I think quite simply there are two camps. There are people who see that democratic legitimacy fundamentally resides at the level of the nation state. And that's why they can't buy into the idea of the Spitzenkandidaten process, etc. And there are people like me who do believe that there is, without claiming that there's such a thing as a European demos, I do actually feel that it is necessary to have something beyond the nation state to make the institutions of the European Union legitimate. It is very hard. What happens is, and if you read the provisions on democratic principles, you see that we try to have it both ways. So we try and say national parliaments are extremely important, and the European Parliament, well, it's also quite important. So we don't want to choose between the two things. And I think there's a tension which is innate. It's in the, and if you ask people how they feel about it, it's, you know, you ask yourself how you feel about it. I recognise these things, and I think there's some sort of balance, and you're not going to have it resolved in one way or another, in my opinion. The struggle will go on. La lotta continua. As far as education is concerned, all I would say is, oh dear, one of the things I had to do in the European Parliament office, we tried to make available material for teachers in secondary schools which explained how the European Parliament worked. In the rather naive and idealistic point of view that, well, we have different levels of government, don't we? We have the local level, and we have the national level, and we have the European level of government. And it's kind of useful for people to have an understanding of all this. This was not prescriptive. We weren't saying this has got to be taught, but in the national curriculum, it is possible to teach it. There was not any other material available, so we said we'd make it available. Did we think we had to interview UKIP members? Of course we did. We interviewed UKIP members. What difference did it make? We were told rubbish, total propaganda by the European Parliament office. These people should go off and do something more useful with their lives. Extraordinarily difficult. Even the teachers themselves said, this is great stuff. We don't have anything. Please, but the climate of opinion is extraordinarily hard to combat. And I could be as eloquent as you like, as persuasive as you like, in a narrow circle. In the wider circle, the Daily Mail circle, I didn't stand a chance.
Yes.
Thank you.
I know this well because I was working alongside you for a period. Mike and I worked together. Well, Michael was my boss for 2.5 years, some time ago when I worked as a press officer at the European Parliament here in the UK for a brief period after leaving journalism and before starting my new sort of life in campaigning. And Maria, I couldn't agree more, basically. It's a double whammy. It's the education side and it's the media side, and they feed into each other. When I was posted in Brussels briefly for a newspaper in the mid-90s, the press corps accredited to the European institution was the largest in the world. It was bigger than the one at the UN. What has happened in the last 20 years is that although numbers, the total numbers haven't really changed. The composition of that press corps has changed in a very meaningful way, seems to me. There's been a dramatic decrease of journalists from the member states of the European Union, including very much from the UK. At the time I was there were lots and lots and lots of correspondence from regional papers. Well, some of those regional papers don't exist anymore, let alone have a correspondent in Brussels. Some of those regional papers now exist as as a complex of 3 or 4 or 5 titles, and maybe there is one news editor for all of them. The luxury of having somebody who understands or even follows what's going on in Brussels, let alone have a bureau there, that's gone. And that's the crisis of print journalism in general, and journalism in general. It's a long story. But those numbers have decreased. The numbers of journalists who make up the total number now, a lot have come from the BRICS countries. So the countries who are now who are doing very well economically, who are sort of powerful, who are going to do well in the future, they're trading with the EU. They are sending journalists thousands of miles away to cover Brussels in Brussels. To me, that is extraordinary. Their publics are better informed about what's happening than our public here. The other point about that is that while public information is decreasing, the level of expertise and the level of presence and therefore the reporting and the quality of reporting is going down, for all these reasons, there's been an exponential rise of lobbyists accredited at the institutions, particularly the Parliament, because the Parliament, of course, has got a lot more power now than it ever did. So if you're a corporation or a large institution, or even if you're Greenpeace, you don't have to be evil. You can be nice. You will have your ear to the ground and you will know exactly what is going on, and you'll be able to intervene and lobby and change and try and whatever. If you are Joe Blogs, the first you hear that something has been agreed is when you read it in the paper, perhaps, or maybe not, when the process is completely done and dusted. So you don't feel that you have any sense of agency. You don't feel that, you can influence the debate, and therefore you probably don't want to vote, don't want to go and vote at the European elections, because what would be the point of doing that? And education is part of that. I remember once when I was working alongside Michael, we took apart a particularly delirious Daily Express front page where they were accusing the European Parliament of spending money on a website, on an educational website. Propaganda in schools. There was something delirious about the fact that the European Parliament had built this website, and it was it was telling young people about the institution, how to vote, etc. These are the people who will vote, once they get to 18. So you might want to tell them what it is, but And he built it up as if it was a sort of dark Soviet or Nazi style apparatus of misinformation and fear. And I literally Googled House of Commons educational website or something, and the first link was exactly the same thing done by the House of Commons. Also, setting up a website doesn't cost that much, to be honest. So the idea that they wanted to interpret the existence of this website, the existence of the information, as some sort of darkly unsettling, conspiratorial thing. To me, that tells you everything you need to know about the state of mind, and that seeps through. Yeah.
I've got to say thank you to Paola and to Michael for what they did, because it was precisely the response that their work triggered that first got me interested in Euroscepticism, on which I've managed to base many years of academic research. So I'm sure that makes it all feel like it's been worthwhile.
Oh, absolutely.
I haven't really got much to add to what the other two have said, except again to say that we're coming back to these themes about the constant changing balance that there is. But actually, if you think about what's happened since Maastricht, the EU still looks roughly like the compromise that we had at Maastricht, which looks roughly like the compromise we had back in Rome. It's going to be a compromise, and I can't see that we are going to have anything radically different. That the elements might shift a bit, we might get progressive change, but fundamental change is not going to come unless we have a systemic collapse You know, that's the only radical change I could see happening in the short run. So we have to accept that the system is built on a whole series of compromises, of package deals, and that's going to not change in any hurry whatsoever. You know, the upshot really is that if we can't do education through schools or things like that, then, you know, we fall back on thinking about other ways that we can kind of do that. You know, there are some excellent books and other resources that are out there. It's my own book, which I'm happy to plug later on, but it's very short. It's even got the word very short in it. So again, we have that. The tension really is between what people should know about, what is important, and what people are interested in. And I think that the real danger is that it's very easy to get into a situation where we say, people should know about this, or they must learn about this because it's important. And I think people, not just in this country, but everywhere, are sensitive to the dangers of being told what they should be learning about.
But at the moment they're told the negative message.
Of course they
so
are. So again, who decides what's important?
It should be equal.
Okay, but again, that's a value judgment. Still, I agree that the nature of information that's out there is uneven, unhelpful, sometimes deliberately misleading. But you know, to say I know what is right for people to know about, or I know what the right balance is a very difficult debate. And you know, if I think about countries, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, in Germany, where we've had historical experiences where history is produced in a particular kind of way, where education is produced in a particular kind of way, which embeds a series of values, then we can see why people are cautious about such things. It doesn't.
I see the opposite here. I see a propaganda. Likewise, you know, so the own daily press criticism. I see that in a way. I mean, not.
Then maybe what we all need to be teaching our school children is about critical thinking, so that they don't trust anything just on its own merits, that they are able to make a critical and informed judgment. I think. Thanks. I leave that to other people to do. But again, you know, it's those kind of skills which are probably the closest we would get to achieving the kind of balance that you talk about.
Can I make a very, very quick observation in answer to Sophie, actually, because I've been thinking all this time and ruminating about this question of European demos, and you know, it's like the $64,000 question: does it exist? What is it? Can it be built? Etc. etc. But I wanted to perhaps inject a note of optimism and pride in all this conversation that we've been having, and say that the existence of the single market and the way that it has developed, it's not just an economic construct, and it's not just about jobs and about trade, etc., etc. It's about the kind of values that we attach to the way that we do things. And to me, that is an expression, in a way, of a European way of thinking and of a European way of deciding what values are important and what what matters in life. And I'll give you an example. So we're basically saying, if you want to trade with us, your goods have to be done according to a certain standard. They have to be quality goods. They cannot contain horrifically toxic material. They cannot be made by slaves. They cannot make people sick, and so on and so forth. There is a sort of minimum level of the possibility of expressing what kind of values through goods, to production. It's not the only way in which you express values, is a very marginal way, but it's important because this is a consumer society.
Do you think that's a particularly European concept? You don't think that exists in the United States or in Japan or anywhere else in the world?
I do, but we're able to decide. But we're able to decide that, you know, we don't want cruelty, for instance, to be used in the production of cosmetics. And we're able to make that decision and that expression. And maybe other countries feel like that, but to be 500 million people making that decision, and you know, for you to have to abide by those rules if you want to trade with that large bloc, makes it stick more. I mean, I'm thinking about environmental legislation. Just the other day we were looking at some pesticides that Europe decided to ban because they're harmful to bees. Europe has banned them last year. The US will ban them in 2018 when there might not be any bees left. I don't know. The point is that if we certain things that we believe in, we can express through the single market as well. It doesn't have to be just about pounds and pennies. And to me, that's quite important. And the way that people are treated, in the production of those goods and how safe the goods have to be, etc., etc. It's not nothing, it's something. It doesn't compete with Goethe and Molière, but it's also an expression of who we are, I think.
Since Paola's trying to be upbeat and optimistic, I'm going to be optimistic, but I'm going to do it in a British way, which won't sound very optimistic. European integration is always in crisis. You pick any period since the end of the Second World War, and there's been a crisis of some kind. There's empty chairs, there's Eurosclerosis, there's the challenge from Japan, there's the challenge from China, there's periods of reflection, which is the most euphemistically named period I have ever encountered. There's always something. And I think it's really easy for us to get very concerned that all of these problems are insurmountable, that this is the worst it's ever been. We've had very bad crises before when the system had a lot less depth, a lot less entanglement in national systems. And we found ways through that. Messy ways, compromised ways, imperfect ways, but ways. And I think it's easy to forget that in the miasma of everything that's wrong with everything, and there's no way out. There's always a way out. And I think if we despair, whatever we think, then I think we're going to have a problem. But actually, I have a lot more confidence than I might have conveyed in the past hour and a half about the ability to find a way through. It won't be pretty, but I think there is something there that will come through.
We're almost at the end of our time. Michael, would you like to make a concluding statement before I actually conclude?
I'm not, well, I tell you what, yes, let me just be a bit optimistic too. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're talking about European demos. I think one should not exaggerate, but coming down on the train today, I looked on my iPhone and I saw that 38 Degrees, an organisation that I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with, was urging me to get involved with the TTIP negotiations between the EU and the US. And I think that's... I mean, there's a question of how many people are linked in with 38 Degrees, but rather, many thousands of people are in, who are not people who are lobby groups, who are active in Brussels, but who are people just linked through the internet, who've been made aware of the potential consequences of this agreement, and who are going to try to obtain certain changes to the way in which this agreement is negotiated, or the shape of the agreement. And I think that's, leaving aside the merits of the case, I think it's a important change that people think it's worthwhile. They actually say we should be in touch with MEPs from other nationalities. I almost fell down off my chair in the train when I read that, British people were going to actually get in touch with MEPs of other nationalities. Good. That's a good sign. It's a sign that people care about these issues. I think Simon's absolutely right. The idea, if you start saying, I don't really care about it at all, TTIP will happen whatever I do, well, then that's serious. If people are prepared to actually put their name down and say, I don't like the look of what's coming from TTIP. I don't like the idea that it could have some nasty effects on the NHS. I don't quite understand the details, but I'm going to find out more about it. And I'm going to see whether we should lobby the European Parliament, because actually it is the European Parliament which will determine whether this agreement gets agreed or not, because it has the right to say yes or no. So not just on co-decision, but on international agreements, the role of the European Parliament is of staggering importance. So I don't think all is difficult in the garden. It's just that one can't have exaggerated expectations of what the European Union is able to do. It is the sort of set of bodies where things are not resolved permanently in one way or another in favour of democratic legitimacy at national level, at European level. It's not like that. And only those who want it to be resolved in one way or another are the ones who are going to be inevitably disappointed.
Thank you very much, Michael, Paola, Simon, especially for these last upbeat plaidoyers. Thank you all for coming to our first Policy and Practice seminar series. And I think our three speakers deserve a great round of applause.